My mom begged me to come home for the holidays, and I should have known better. My name is Claire Miller, I'm 30 years old, I live in London, and like an idiot, I genuinely believed that this Christmas might be different. She called me at 3 in the morning London time, and I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand with her name flashing on the screen. When I answered, she was already crying, full sobs, the kind that make it hard to breathe, telling me how we never see you anymore, how the whole family feels incomplete without you, how the kids keep asking when Aunt Claire is coming home. I lay there in the dark, jet-lagged before I'd even left, listening to her talk about how much she missed me and how much everyone needed me there. 10 hours on an overnight flight, 2 layovers, a dead phone battery, a stiff back, and the lingering smell of airplane coffee in my clothes, and I still showed up on her doorstep in San Diego with a suitcase full of gifts for my brother's kids. I rang the doorbell with my heart pounding, stupidly hoping she'd hug me the way she used to when I was a kid, tight and familiar, like I belonged there, but the door flew open with no hello, no how was your flight, and no hug. My mom's eyes went straight to my suitcase and she said, completely casually, that I'd be babysitting my brother's kids because they were going on a family trip. Before I could even process that, my brother Jason stepped into the doorway behind her with sunglasses still on, a duffel bag over his shoulder, and his kids hanging off his arms like accessories. He smirked and told them not to wipe their snot on Aunt Claire because she was jet-lagged, and they laughed, my parents laughed, and Jason laughed while I stood there exhausted, sore, and thousands of dollars deep in flight charges on my credit card, being treated like the punchline to a joke. I didn't yell and I didn't cry, but I felt something inside me click off, like a switch flipping in my chest. I smiled, set my suitcase down in the entryway, looked my mom straight in the eye, and said one sentence, and that was the moment everything flipped because the laughter stopped, the color drained from their faces, and my mom started whispering no, no, no way. By the time I was done, their dream vacation wasn't happening, their house was on the line, and I was finally finished being their free babysitter and personal bank. Stay with me until the end because I'll tell you exactly how one so-called ungrateful daughter ruined her family's perfect holiday and took her life back in the process. But to understand why that room froze when I spoke, you need to know what had been happening long before I ever booked that flight. My mom didn't just miss me when she called from San Diego because 2 weeks before that 3 a.m. FaceTime, she had already started planting the seeds by texting me screenshots of insanely expensive holiday packages and casually hinting that she and my dad could never afford something like that unless I helped a little, just this once, which was how every favor always started. When my dad needed knee surgery, I wired money. When Jason maxed out his credit cards chasing a big e-commerce idea, I helped consolidate his debt. And when the water heater broke and the mortgage was overdue, I sent money and then watched my mom post photos from a new brunch place the following week. I lived in a tiny flat in London, cooked most of my meals at home, and walked to work in the rain, yet somehow I was still paying for Uber Eats, streaming services, phone plans, and emergency Venmo requests for a house I didn't live in on a continent I didn't even live on anymore. This time, before I booked my ticket, I paid attention and saved every Zelle transfer, every PayPal receipt, and every thank you honey we'll pay you back when things calm down, and that's when I noticed something else, an email from the bank telling me my name was on a mortgage. I didn't remember signing. Years earlier, they had quietly listed me as a co-borrower just for a better rate, and ever since then I'd been covering the shortfalls without realizing how deep the hole really was. So while my mom cried on FaceTime about how much the kids missed me, I was sitting on my bed in London staring at my banking app and finally understanding something brutal, that the only time my family treated me like part of the group was when a bill was due. I almost said no and almost told her to figure it out herself, but then a different thought hit me, and if they were willing to drag me halfway across the world to use me again, I was finally willing to stop playing along. I booked my flight, then booked a call with a financial advisor, downloaded 3 years of statements, and had a simple legal document drafted online, so when I rolled my suitcase into that kitchen and saw their glossy resort itinerary laid out like a promise on the counter, I wasn't the tired daughter they expected anymore because I was done being invisible. Growing up, Jason was always the center of gravity in our house, the loud one, the golden boy, the kid who never had to ask twice. Teachers loved him, coaches worshipped him, and my parents built their schedules around his games and his moods. I learned early how to stay out of the way, how to clean up quietly, how to be useful instead of demanding, and that habit followed me into adulthood without me realizing it. Jason never outgrew the version of himself that peaked in high school, and even now in his late 30s he still talked about championships like they were credentials and used confidence as a substitute for responsibility. When things went right, it was because he was talented, and when things went wrong, it was always someone else's fault, usually the economy, the system, or bad luck. My parents never challenged that story, and over time it became easier for them to believe that Jason needed help while I could handle myself. That difference mattered more than any argument ever did. After I moved to London, the distance changed nothing except the method. Instead of last-minute emergencies in person, I got late-night calls and urgent messages with just enough panic to make me feel guilty for hesitating. Jason's voice would come through speakerphone complaining about cash flow, investors who didn't come through, or another plan that just needed a little breathing room, and my mom would hover in the background, adding quiet comments about how stressful things had been and how grateful they were to have a daughter who understood sacrifice. Every time I helped, it was framed as temporary, a bridge until things stabilized, but the bridge never ended. It just became expected. The kids were part of it too, though none of this was their fault. Every request came wrapped in concern for them: tuition fees, daycare gaps, school trips that couldn't be missed, birthdays that had to be perfect. Saying no felt like punishing children who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, and my parents knew that. They never asked outright, they hinted, sighed, and waited, confident I'd step in because I always had. Jason learned quickly that he didn't need to ask me himself. All he had to do was create a problem big enough that my mom would panic and call. Over time, small things started to feel off, moments I'd brushed past before because it was easier not to look too closely. Jason would talk about money struggles while wearing a new watch, my mom would stress about bills but post photos from weekend getaways, and every time I brought it up gently, I was told not to be dramatic or to stop keeping score. When I visited once for a summer wedding, I noticed how easily plans were made around my availability, errands assigned without asking, favors expected without thanks, as if my time was communal property the moment I stepped through the door. I told myself it was just how families worked, that distance had made me sensitive, that pushing back would only create conflict. But the pattern never changed, and it intensified the more successful I became on my own. My job in London wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and stability, to my family, meant excess. It meant I could afford to help, afford to understand, afford to wait. Jason resented that in a quiet way, masked his jokes and comments about how easy I had it overseas, how I'd escaped responsibility, how I didn't really know what real pressure felt like anymore. My parents never corrected him, and their silence taught me exactly where I stood. By the time that Christmas rolled around, I wasn't just visiting family, I was walking back into a system that had already decided my role. The babysitting wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, it was an assumption built on years of conditioning, years of me showing up, paying up, and staying quiet. The trip they were planning didn't include me because I was never meant to be part of it, I was meant to hold everything together while they left. Standing in that entryway, watching Jason grin like none of this was unusual, I finally saw the truth without excuses, and it wasn't cruelty that hurt the most, it was how normal it all felt to them. That was the moment I understood something clearly for the first time in my life, that if I didn't interrupt this pattern myself, no one else ever would, and that realization made what I said next inevitable. Christmas Eve had always been my mom's favorite day of the year, the one she treated like a performance instead of a holiday, and that year was no different. The house was already over-decorated when I arrived, garlands layered over garlands, candles burning despite the heat, music playing just a little too loud, as if noise could cover tension. The kitchen smelled like butter and rosemary and something sweet burning at the edges, and my mom moved through it all with forced cheer, issuing instructions like a director rushing to open night. She talked nonstop about how special this Christmas was going to be, how everyone deserved a break, how hard the year had been, never once mentioning where I fit into any of it. By late afternoon, the table was set with the good plates, the ones that only came out for guests, and the counter was covered with printed itineraries, glossy pages showing beachside resorts and infinity pools, casually weighted down with a salt shaker like they weren't the most important thing in the room. Jason paced between rooms on his phone, complaining about airline delays and laughing loudly whenever someone passed, already halfway checked out. His kids ran circles around the living room, high on sugar and excitement, asking when they were leaving, asking who was driving them to the airport, asking if Aunt Claire was staying behind, and every question landed like a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. Ray showed up just before dinner, my dad's friend who had become Jason's sounding board over the years, the kind of man who always had an opinion and never had to live with the consequences. He brought wine no one opened and jokes that didn't quite land, filling space where discomfort might otherwise settle. When he shook my hand, he smiled like he was greeting staff instead of family, and that small gesture somehow said more than anything else had. Dinner itself felt like waiting for a storm, polite conversation stretched thin over undercurrents no one wanted to acknowledge. I passed dishes, refilled glasses, wiped spills, automatically slipping into the role they expected, even as something inside me stayed detached and alert. When my mom finally called everyone to sit, chairs scraped loudly against the floor, and without thinking, I reached for the seat at the head of the table, the one my dad usually took when he wasn't busy carving the turkey. It wasn't a power move, it was muscle memory, a place I'd sat 100 times growing up. That was when Jason moved. He didn't shout, didn't argue, just stepped closer and shoved the chair hard enough that it knocked into my legs. He told me, flat and loud enough for everyone to hear, that the seat belonged to his dad and that I needed to get out. I lost my balance and went down hard, the room blurring as the edge of the table caught my hip and a bowl of gravy tipped, spilling hot and brown across the floor and my clothes. For a second, no one moved, and then there was laughter, nervous and scattered, like people weren't sure if they were allowed to react. I looked up from the floor, my palms sticky, my chest tight, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something, but my mom didn't look at me at all. She stayed focused on the table, on the mess, on keeping things moving, telling Jason to sit down and telling the kids to stop staring, as if I was an inconvenience instead of her daughter on the ground. My dad avoided my eyes completely, and Ray shook his head like this was an unfortunate misunderstanding instead of a clear line being crossed. Something in me went very quiet then. The embarrassment faded first, then the anger, replaced by a cold clarity that felt steadier than anything I'd known before. I realized that this wasn't about a chair or even about respect in that moment, it was about permission, and they had all given Jason permission a long time ago. Permission to push, to take, to assume I would absorb it and still stay. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on a towel, and smiled, not because I was okay, but because I finally understood the rules of the game I'd been playing. I set my suitcase down carefully in the entryway, straightened my clothes, and looked directly at my mom. I said one sentence, calm and clear, and the effect was immediate. The room froze, conversations cut off mid-word, and my mom's face drained of color as she whispered no over and over like she was trying to rewind time. Jason stopped smirking. Ray stopped smiling. In that moment, they all realized something had shifted, even if they didn't yet understand how far. The trip they were planning, the money they were counting on, the house they assumed was safe, all of it suddenly felt uncertain. I wasn't yelling or threatening, I wasn't dramatic or emotional, and that terrified them more than any scene ever could. Standing there, surrounded by decorations and silence, I felt steady in a way I never had before. I wasn't asking for apologies or explanations, and I wasn't waiting for permission. I had crossed an invisible line, and nothing after that point was going to work the way it used to. And while they were still trying to process what I'd said, I was already thinking about what came next, because Christmas Eve wasn't the end of the story, it was just the moment the truth finally stopped being convenient to ignore. After the frozen moment in the kitchen, the reality set in quickly. No one knew exactly what to do next, and the silence stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. My mom clutched the itinerary in her hands, eyes wide, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and Jason leaned against the counter, jaw tight, scrolling through his phone like it could fix everything. My dad remained seated at the table, hands gripping the edge, staring at the floor as if the tiles themselves had betrayed him. I took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle before I spoke again. I pulled my laptop from my bag, set it on the dining table, and opened it to the folder I'd prepared over months of late nights and careful tracking. Each document, every transfer, every PayPal and Zelle screenshot, meticulously saved, organized, dated, color-coded to make the story undeniable. I slid the screen toward them so everyone could see. My voice stayed steady, calm, because the anger had already served its purpose. What mattered now was clarity. "Before you go anywhere," I said, "we need to talk about money." Jason groaned immediately. "Claire, seriously, right now?" But I ignored him, letting the words hang, letting the weight of my years of effort finally press into the room. My mom whispered, pleading, "Honey, can't we just, this isn't the time, please, don't start now," but I didn't raise my voice. I clicked to the first file, labeled clearly, Miller Household. The spreadsheet opened across the screen, lines stacking transfers, color blocks highlighting dates, and amounts that made it impossible to ignore. "Last March," I began, scrolling slowly, letting the numbers speak. "You called me because the mortgage was 2 months behind. I wired $1,200. In June, Jason's business expenses maxed out his card. I sent $2,500. When the water heater broke, $900. Dad's truck tires, $600. Electric bill overdue, $400. Every month for 3 years, there's something." I paused only long enough for the figures to register in the room. This isn't even counting the streaming services, Uber Eats, or random emergency Venmo requests timed around Black Friday and Labor Day sales. I could see the realization on Jason's face first. His color drained, jaw slackening as the spreadsheet started to feel like a mirror he hadn't been ready to look into. My mom's hand flew to her mouth, trembling, as the screenshots of texts popped up next to the transfers, casual requests that now read like confessions. My dad's face went white when he saw the PayPal labeled knee surgery copay alongside receipts for brunches and flat screens. I kept scrolling, deliberately slow, highlighting each connection between a message, a request, a transfer, and the real expense. "This," I said finally, tapping the total row in bold, "is just over $60,000. In the last 36 months, I've sent this house that much." The room went silent, utterly quiet, the kind of silence that fills ears with your own heartbeat. Jason blinked like the numbers themselves had slapped him awake. My dad stared at the wall, refusing to meet my eyes. My mom whispered, "No, that can't be right, that can't be right," repeating it like words could undo the math. I shook my head. "I'm not making you look bad. I'm just showing you what actually happened." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin stack of printed pages, the simple legal agreement I'd had drafted with the advisor. I laid it on the counter next to their resort brochure. "This isn't a lawsuit. It isn't me taking anyone to court. It's just a record that acknowledges these numbers and ensures that payments start being made, even if slowly, even if $50 a month or $100, whatever is manageable. This was never a gift. This has never been a gift." My dad snapped first, voice loud, almost shaking the room, "We are family. You don't put family in debt like this." I met his gaze evenly. Family doesn't hide a mortgage in their daughter's name. Family doesn't spend her money and then tell the world she abandoned you. Family doesn't call me for help and act like they're the victims. The color drained from Jason's face as he skimmed the pages, disbelief cracking his voice. I can't pay this back. None of us can." I leaned back, letting that settle. "I don't expect you to. But I am done living in a world where you pretend you're victims and I'm the selfish one. If you tell anyone I left you with nothing, I have every receipt, every transfer, every bill. I am done being your ATM, your babysitter, your invisible safety net." I opened another tab, pointing to the resort confirmation, last 4 digits of my card visible. "As for this family trip? Cancelled." I called the resort. I called the airline. Since the bookings were made with my account, the refund is in process. No vacation. Not without me. Not without my money. Not ever again on my dime. My mom started to cry quietly, real tears, small and broken. Jason dropped his shoulders, defeated, scanning the documents in disbelief. My dad muttered something under his breath about punishment, but I ignored it. I had made my point, and that point was clear: boundaries were no longer negotiable, and accountability was no longer optional. I picked up my suitcase, ready to leave, and as I walked toward the door, I paused to say one last thing. If I am not welcome without my credit card, then I was never truly welcome at all. I stepped outside into the California sun, shut the door, and let the echo of my independence settle around me for the first time in years. I stood on the curb for a moment, breathing in the crisp California air, the suitcase heavy at my side but somehow lighter than the weight that had been pressing on my chest for years. I called an Uber and told the driver the address of my new condo in downtown San Diego, a place I had quietly claimed months ago, long before this showdown, long before I realized I had the right to finally step out of the role my family had written for me. 15 minutes later, I was unlocking the door to my own space, a tiny, freshly painted one-bedroom with new carpet and a view over city lights that felt impossibly big compared to the suffocating atmosphere I'd left behind. I rolled my suitcase inside, dropped it in the middle of the room, and paused to take it all in. There was no stove piled with dishes that weren't mine, no frantic FaceTime calls, no whispered guilt-laden reminders that you're the only one who can help. The condo smelled like paint and possibility, like I was finally allowed to inhabit a life built on my terms. I opened my laptop, checked my banking app, and one by one, canceled the remaining payments I had been keeping afloat for them: Disney Plus, Hulu, Spotify, the shared cloud storage, random Apple charges for games. Each confirmation pinged through like a small exhale, a string snapping loose from my ribs, and with every ping, the tension in my shoulders eased. I brewed a cheap cup of grocery store coffee, sat cross-legged on the floor because I didn't have a couch yet, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: quiet. Mine. The doubts came naturally. What if I'd gone too far? What if their bills piled up? What if they really couldn't pay the lights and the water and I had made them homeless? But then I remembered the door, their laughter, the way my mom had looked past my face and straight at my suitcase like I was nothing more than a delivery service. I remembered the spreadsheet, the legal documents, the months of proof that I had been the only adult in the room paying attention. And under the fear and the guilt, something new settled: peace. A thin, quiet layer of it, and it didn't feel fragile, it felt earned. Over the next few weeks, I watched the dominoes fall from a distance. Envelopes began arriving at their house, letters from the bank, notices from utility companies, reminders that the comforts they had taken for granted had a price. My mom sent hesitant texts: "Did you talk to the bank? They want updated information. There's something from the IRS. I am freaking out." Each message was tinged with panic, but also a small acknowledgement that their world could no longer run on invisible credit. Jason began hustling in ways he never had before: extra shifts, downsizing his apartment, sharing rooms for his kids, selling old tech. The family that had leaned on me for everything, for years, was suddenly forced to reckon with reality. I didn't respond publicly to my dad's posts about my supposed betrayal, even though every fiber of me wanted to defend myself, to share the spreadsheet, the transfers, the documents proving exactly who had been covering whom. I didn't have to. My receipts were my shield, my advisor my ally, my independence the message loudest of all. I focused on building my life, small step by small step. I furnished my condo slowly, bought a second-hand couch, strung up cheap fairy lights, made a tree from scraps of imagination and thrift. Every item I put in place was a reminder that this life belonged to me and me alone. Then, one rainy Tuesday in December, there was a knock on the door. My mom. Smaller somehow, unmade, clutching a reusable grocery bag like armor. I let her in. She looked around at my little living room, the view, the tree with 3 mismatched ornaments. "I didn't know it looked like this," she said softly. I shrugged. "This is what I can afford without paying for 2 households." She handed me an envelope with a check, not for $60,000, but for a fraction of it. "It's from selling things, extra shifts, whatever I could," she said. I looked at her, at the honesty in her voice, and realized something. She was finally acknowledging what had been true for years. I smiled, sat next to her, leaving space, and said simply, I made the spreadsheet for me, not for him. I'm not here to rescue anyone anymore. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and asked quietly if someday we could have a Christmas without money, without hidden bills, just dinner. I nodded. Maybe, I said. Only if everyone in that house understood I am no longer their safety net. If I come, it will be because I want to, not because they expect it. She hugged me, and this time it was real. That night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, lights blinking, hot chocolate in hand, and realized something fundamental. Family doesn't stop being family just because you say no. The people who truly love you adjust to boundaries. The ones who only wanted your money call you selfish the moment you stop bleeding for them. It's painful. It's lonely. But sometimes, distance is the only way to breathe, the only way to protect yourself from drowning in someone else's bad decisions. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to let that truth guide me. So here's my question to you. If the people draining your time, your energy, your sanity, or your bank account share your last name, will you keep paying the price to be called loyal, or will you finally give yourself permission to be your own family first? If this story moved you, gave you perspective, or just made you think about boundaries and self-respect, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that inspire, empower, and remind you that it's okay to put yourself first. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see your life and the people around you.